Before sunset on July 28, 1945, the Pacific glowed red with oil fires that stretched for miles. Japan's destroyer Kirisame had gone under, broken in half by American shell fire, and hundreds of sailors were left screaming in the smoke. Through the haze came the outline of USS Lansdowne, her hull dented, guns overheated, paint still blistering from battle. The fight was finished, but what her crew saw next would test something deeper than courage. Bodies, dozens of them, still alive, Japanese sailors floating in the burning sea. Orders were clear: no stops, no survivors. But the men on deck looked at one another and turned back anyway. In that moment, war paused. Enemies became men again, faces lit by the same fire that nearly killed them. It was a rescue no one expected, one Japan would never forget. If you were standing on that deck, would you have turned back too? July 1945. The Pacific War was over in all but name, a colossal fire burning down to its last embers. From Tokyo to Nagasaki, Japan's cities were turning to ash under the relentless fury of B-29 bombers. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was now a ghost fleet, its greatest battleships, Yamato, Musashi, lying miles deep on the ocean floor, its carriers sunk, its fuel reserves empty. The seas around Japan no longer belonged to the Emperor. They belonged to the United States Navy. This was the brutal final act. The Americans had established a blockade so tight it was called Operation Starvation. The mission was no longer about glorious fleet-on-fleet battles. It was a slow, grinding, and merciless strangulation. U.S. destroyers, submarines, and aircraft carrier groups roamed the coastal waters with impunity, executing what sailors called a mopping-up operation. Their orders were simple: sink anything that moved. Every fishing boat trying to feed the starving population, every transport ferry shuttling troops, every last destroyer trying to make a desperate run, all were legitimate targets. The war had become total. On the American side, the crews were victorious but exhausted. They had fought their way across thousands of miles of ocean, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. They had seen kamikazes dive out of the sun and watched their sister ships vanish in fireballs. Now, in July 1945, they were the undisputed masters, but the tension never left. The enemy was beaten but not broken. On the Japanese side, the mentality was one of fatalistic duty. The Bushido Code, the warrior spirit of Japan, demanded resistance until the last man. To surrender was unthinkable, a shame worse than death. Sailors boarded their ships knowing they were likely on a one-way mission. Every destroyer still afloat was a potential suicide weapon. Every crewman, a potential kamikaze. This was the world the USS Lansdowne sailed in. She was a Fletcher-class destroyer, the workhorse of the U.S. Navy, fast, tough, and armed to the teeth. Her crew had seen it all. They were hunters, tasked with enforcing the blockade, their eyes constantly scanning the radar scopes for the last remnants of a dying navy. They weren't looking for a fair fight. They were looking for a kill. In these final desperate weeks of the war, the line between combatant and civilian, between fighting a war and simply erasing an enemy, had blurred into the gray smoke that covered the horizon. The rules of engagement were written in steel: find the enemy, destroy him, and move on. There was no room for hesitation, and absolutely none for mercy. In this lethal endgame, Task Group 35-4 was a scalpel, part of Admiral William Bull Halsey's Third Fleet. This group of destroyers was let off the leash. Their specific hunting ground was the Kii Suidō, the vital channel leading into Japan's inland sea. It was one of the last remaining arteries pumping life into the Japanese war machine, a route used by blockade runners and the few destroyers still operational. The mission given to the flagship, USS Lansdowne, and her sister ship, USS Madison, was not a complex trap like the Surigao Strait. It was simpler. It was a seek-and-destroy sweep. They were to patrol the darkness, and anything that appeared on their radar screens was to be annihilated. The USS Lansdowne, DD-486, was a veteran. A sleek, 2,000-ton Fletcher-class destroyer, she was the embodiment of American industrial might. Fast, agile and bristling with 5-inch guns and torpedoes. Her crew had seen action from the Aleutian Islands to the Philippines. They were hardened professionals, not rookies looking for glory. They knew the hum of the radar meant death for someone. In command was Commander W.B. Porter, a man responsible not just for the mission, but for the 200 souls aboard his ship. In July 1945, every captain in the U.S. Navy knew the greatest danger wasn't a battleship. It was the desperation of the Japanese. A single kamikaze plane or a Kaiten suicide torpedo could end a ship's life in a blinding flash. Porter's first duty was to protect his men, and that meant striking first and without mercy. Their prey on this night was the Japanese destroyer Kirisame. She was an older ship, a Shiratsuyu-class destroyer, and a veteran of countless brutal battles, including Guadalcanal. But in 1945, she was a shadow of her former self. Lacking fuel, experienced crew, and modern radar, she was dangerously exposed. Her mission was one of grim necessity, escorting a convoy, trying to slip past the American net under the cover of darkness. Her captain knew the odds. He knew the waters were swarming with American hunters equipped with radar that could see for miles in the pitch black. To sail in the Kii Suidō was to sail into a lion's den. For the Lansdowne, this was a hunt. For the Kirisame, it was a desperate gamble, a final run against a superior foe in a war that was already lost. The night of July 28th was moonless, the Kii Suidō a channel of perfect blackness. Aboard the USS Lansdowne, the only light on the bridge was the faint, sickly green glow of the radar console. Sailors stood at their stations, the silence broken only by the hum of the engines and the rhythmic ping of the sonar. Suddenly the radar operator leaned in. His voice, calm but sharp, cut through the quiet. Radar contact. Bearing 030, range 1,000 yards. A small blip had appeared on the screen, moving slowly, hugging the coast. Commander Porter watched the plot. The target was sluggish, its track unsteady. It wasn't a fast-moving warship on patrol. It was something trying not to be seen. A second blip appeared, the Kirisame and its convoy. On the bridge of the Lansdowne and her sister ship, the USS Madison, the order was given. All engines ahead flank. The destroyers surged forward, slicing through the black water at over 30 knots. They were wolves closing in on unsuspecting prey. The Japanese, with their primitive radar, were completely blind. They had no idea that 2 American destroyers, guided by invisible waves, were racing directly towards them. The Lansdowne's fire control team locked onto the larger target, the Kirisame. The ship's main computer, an analog marvel of gears and servos, began calculating the firing solution. Range, bearing, wind speed, and the ship's own role were all factored in. The 5-inch gun turrets, 3 forward and 2 aft, swiveled silently, aiming at a target they could not see. At just under 10,000 yards, point-blank range for these guns, Commander Porter gave the command, "Commence firing." The night shattered. The Lansdowne's main battery erupted in a deafening roar, spitting orange-white flames that momentarily lit up the decks. Seconds later, the Madison opened up. A stream of high-explosive shells screamed through the darkness. The first salvos were short, splashing into the sea, but the radar-corrected aim was fast. The next salvo found its mark. Lookouts on the Lansdowne yelled, "Hit! Hit! We have a hit!" They could see the flashes against the dark outline of the Japanese coast. Dull orange bursts as American shells tore through Kirisame's thin hull. For the Japanese crew, it was sheer terror. Out of the total darkness, a storm of steel rained down on them. There was no warning, no muzzle flash to aim at. Shells ripped through the bridge, the engine room, and the decks. One salvo likely struck her torpedo mounts, causing a massive secondary explosion. The Kirisame shuddered violently, her forward momentum stopping almost instantly. She broke in two, her bow and stern rising towards the sky as fire engulfed her midsection. She was done. In less than 5 minutes, the veteran destroyer was a burning wreck, sliding beneath the waves. The Lansdowne and Madison raced past the wreckage at full speed, their guns falling silent. Their orders were clear: do not stop, do not linger. The sea was still full of dangers. The target was destroyed, mission accomplished. Moments like this blur the line between heroism and humanity. If you were in Commander Porter's place, would you have risked your crew to save the enemy? Tell me honestly in the comments. I'm reading every one. The two American destroyers, Lansdowne and Madison, continued their patrol sweep, their hulls cutting cleanly through the water, leaving the burning wreckage of the Kirisame miles behind in their wake. On the bridge, the atmosphere was professional, almost sterile. The radar was clear, the target was neutralized, and the adrenaline of combat was fading. They had done their job. The men on deck began securing their gear, the gun turrets swinging back to their forward positions. But as the ships moved further away, the wind shifted. It carried something over the water, something that wasn't gunpowder or engine smoke. It was the faint, unmistakable sound of human voices, screams carried across the dark water. Sailors on the Lansdowne's deck paused, looking at each other, then back into the darkness. Far behind them, the spot where the Kirisame went down was no longer just a radar blip. It was a patch of ocean on fire, a flickering orange stain against the black, marking a grave. And in that grave, men were still alive. On the bridge, Commander Porter faced the destroyer captain's worst dilemma. His standing orders from Admiral Halsey were absolute. Do not stop. Every sailor in the fleet knew this rule. To stop a destroyer in enemy coastal waters, especially after a battle, was suicide. It turned a fast-moving hunter into a stationary, illuminated target. The area was notorious for Japanese submarines and Kiiten suicide torpedoes, which were likely already drawn to the commotion. To stop was to risk his ship and the lives of his entire 200-man crew for an enemy that had been trying to kill them just minutes before. The crew was tense. They watched their captain. They had all seen the kamikaze attacks. They knew the Japanese doctrine of fighting to the last man, of never surrendering. To them, the men in the water weren't just sailors. They were the enemy. An enemy that had shown them no mercy throughout the long, bloody war. Rescuing them felt like a betrayal of their own fallen comrades. But the sounds grew louder. The fire on the horizon silhouetted dozens of heads bobbing in the oily water. They were defeated, disarmed, and drowning. They were no longer warriors. They were just men. Commander Porter stood on the bridge wing, weighing his orders against his conscience. He weighed the lives of his crew against the lives of the men dying in the water. Every second he waited, more men drowned, and the risk to his own ship grew. Finally, he turned to his helmsman. He gave the order that went against every rule of engagement in the Pacific theater. All engines stop. Left full rudder. We're going back. The USS Lansdowne didn't race back into the inferno. She crept. Every man was at battle stations. Every gun was manned. But their purpose was agonizingly inverted. Lookouts scanned the darkness with binoculars, their eyes straining not for targets, but for the white wake of an incoming torpedo. The ship's sonar pinged frantically, searching for the metallic pulse of a lurking submarine. Commander Porter was holding his 2,000-ton destroyer stationary in a known kill zone, illuminated by the very fires he had started. Alongside him, the USS Madison slowed its engines, joining the rescue, its own crew staring in disbelief as they, too, turned back toward the enemy. The scene they entered was a floating hell. The ocean was a thick black syrup of heavy fuel oil, patches of it burning with an oily, acrid smoke that stung the eyes and choked the lungs. The heat was so intense it blistered the paint on the destroyer's hull. Amidst the floating debris and the broken sections of the Kirisame, hundreds of men were struggling. Their screams were thin and desperate. As the Lansdowne glided among them, a strange silence fell over the Japanese sailors in the water. They stopped screaming, paddling weakly away from the American giant. They had been trained their whole lives that the Americans were barbarians who executed prisoners. They were terrified, certain they were about to be machine-gunned in the water. "Throw over the nets! Ropes, life rings! Get 'em aboard!" The orders rang out on the Lansdowne's deck. The same American sailors who, just 30 minutes earlier, had been clinically firing salvos to kill these men, now scrambled to save them. Cargo nets unfurled down the side of the hull. Ropes snaked out across the oily water. At first, the Japanese sailors refused to grab them. They recoiled in fear. An American yeoman, leaning far over the side, locked eyes with a young, badly burned Japanese sailor. The sailor flinched. The yeoman yelled, "Come on! Grab it! Damn it, grab it!" He didn't see an enemy. He saw a drowning man. He stretched his arm down, and the Japanese sailor, in a final act of desperation, grabbed his wrist. That first touch broke the spell. All along the hulls of the Lansdowne and Madison, enemy hands grabbed American ropes. The rescue became frantic. The men were covered in thick, slippery oil, making them almost impossible to hold. Many were too weak or too badly burned to climb. American sailors, ignoring the risk to themselves, leaned over the railings, grabbing men by their uniforms, their hair, their arms, anything to haul them aboard. The decks of the destroyers became a surreal landscape. Oil-slicked, half-naked, wounded, and terrified Japanese sailors collapsed onto the steel, coughing up seawater and oil. American corpsmen, medics, ran from man to man, applying tourniquets, dressing burns, injecting morphine. For these few minutes, on this patch of burning ocean, there were no Americans, no Japanese. There were only rescuers and survivors. As dawn approached, the USS Lansdowne and USS Madison steamed away from the Kii Suidō, their decks slick with oil and crowded with the very men they had been sent to destroy. The rescue had been frantic and dangerous, but astonishingly successful. In total, the two American destroyers had pulled 278 Japanese survivors from the burning water, the crew of the Kirisame and the small convoy ships she was protecting. On the decks, an almost surreal truce had taken hold. American corpsmen moved among the wounded, handing out cigarettes and water, treating horrific burns and shrapnel wounds. The Japanese sailors, who had expected execution, sat in stunned, silent gratitude. They were disarmed, defeated, and alive only because their enemy had chosen to show mercy. When the ships rendezvoused with the main fleet, the reaction was one of bewilderment. Admiral Halsey, a man famous for his kill attitude, was reportedly furious when he heard Commander Porter had stopped his ship in enemy waters. Porter had broken the fleet's most sacred rule. Yet he couldn't be court-martialed for saving nearly 300 lives. The act was a paradox, a breach of orders that was also a profound act of naval chivalry. The prisoners were transferred to a hospital ship, becoming some of the last official POWs of the Pacific War. Just over 2 weeks later, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 15th, the Emperor's voice broadcast over the radio, announcing Japan's unconditional surrender. The war was over, but the story of the Lansdowne was just beginning. In the decades that followed, as Japan rebuilt itself, this incident was not forgotten. It was told and retold in Japanese naval circles and survivor accounts. Why? Because it defied everything they had been taught. In a war defined by racial hatred and take-no-prisoners brutality, the rescue at Kii Suidō was a powerful, undeniable act of humanity. It became a quiet symbol of reconciliation, proof that even in the war's most brutal final moments, the two sides were still, after all, just men. The 278 sailors who were saved went on to live their lives, to build families, to help rebuild their country, all because one American captain, on one dark night, decided to risk everything for his conscience. The Kirisame was a kill, but the rescue of her crew was a victory for something far greater than any single navy.